Erina Foster hadn't planned on playing hero that night. She just wanted to grab $20 and a bag of chips before her shift at the diner, but the second she saw the hooded guy creeping up behind the man at the ATM, her instincts kicked in. "Hey," she shouted, lunging forward before her brain could tell her to stop. "Step away from him." The guy in the hoodie turned, startled, and when he saw her charging forward with a heavy bag swinging from her shoulder like a weapon, he bolted. No knife, no threats, just a coward trying to rob someone who looked too distracted to notice, and that someone was now staring at her like she'd just landed from another planet. "Are you okay?" she asked, panting slightly as she clutched her bag. He blinked. Tall, broad shoulders, sharp jawline. Probably early 30s and clearly still processing everything. Yeah, I think so," he said, his deep voice still a little shaken. Thank you, that could have gone really bad." "I just reacted," Erina said, brushing her messy dark curls out of her eyes. "You need me to call someone, cops?" "Friend," he looked down at the ATM screen, then back at her. No, it's fine, I'll report it later, wow, you really charged at him." "Yeah, well," she muttered, shifting awkwardly. "You looked like you were about to get jumped, and I've had a long day. Didn't feel like watching someone else get screwed over." He chuckled, the sound low and surprised. "I'm Elias Ferris," she blinked. "Okay, I'm Erina." They stood there for a second, awkwardly holding eye contact until she gave a little shrug and turned to walk away. "Wait," he said, stepping forward. Can I at least buy you dinner?" Erina turned her head. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," Elias said. "You just stopped me from getting robbed. The least I can do is feed you." She hesitated. Her stomach growled. "All right, but nothing fancy." "I'm not dressed for it." He smiled, and for a second, Erina thought there was something oddly familiar about him. "I know a place." She didn't expect his idea of not fancy to be a rooftop Italian place with glass walls, candlelight, and a view of the entire city. "Seriously?" she whispered as they stepped out of the private elevator. "You said casual." "This is casual," Elias said with a straight face. "For who? The royal family?" He laughed again, and the sound was starting to grow on her. They sat, and a waiter immediately brought wine and menus that didn't have prices. Erina stared at the tablecloth, trying to figure out what she'd just stepped into. "So, what do you do?" she asked, picking at the bread basket. "I run a few companies," he said vaguely. "Like?" "What kind of companies?" "Tech, real estate, a bit of everything." She raised a brow. "So, you're rich," Elias shrugged. "I do okay." She narrowed her eyes. "You own this restaurant, don't you?" He smiled. "Maybe." "Unbelievable," she muttered. "I save your life and you turn out to be Batman." He laughed again, more freely this time. "I wasn't expecting to meet anyone tonight. Definitely not someone who'd chase off a mugger with zero hesitation." "I wasn't expecting to eat truffle ravioli either," she said, eyeing the plate in front of her. They talked for over 2 hours. About music, movies, how New York was the worst and best place at the same time. He didn't talk much about himself, and she didn't push. But he asked her about everything: her job at the diner, her dream of becoming a nurse, her mom who lived 2 states away. He listened like no one ever had. When dinner ended, he walked her to the street and handed the valet a sleek black key. A luxury car pulled up and Erina blinked. "You want a ride home?" he asked. "No, I'm good," she said quickly. "I'll take the subway." He looked like he wanted to argue but nodded. "Okay, but can I see you again?" Erina hesitated. "You're not just saying that because I saved your butt." He shook his head. "No, I'm saying that because I haven't felt this in a long time." She looked at him, and something about the way he said it quietly, sincerely made her chest tighten. "Okay," she said. "One more dinner. And maybe no rooftop next time." He smiled. "Deal." The next 2 weeks moved fast. Elias showed up at her diner the next day like it was normal, sitting at the counter in a tailored coat that probably cost more than her rent. He ordered coffee, tipped way too much, and left her a note on a napkin. Dinner tonight. They went to a jazz bar, then a food truck in Brooklyn, then a museum after hours because apparently Elias could make that happen. He never pushed, never tried to impress her with his wealth. But it was there in the background, in the way he casually ordered a private car, the way staff fawned over him. The way strangers stared when he walked into a room, and every time Erina thought, what exactly does he do? But she didn't ask, not yet. Because every time they were together, it felt like the world got quiet, like someone had turned the noise down. And the way he looked at her like he wasn't used to being surprised, and she was his favorite one, it made her feel seen in a way she didn't even know she missed. One night, after a late walk in Central Park, he stopped and said, "I feel like I've known you longer than I actually have." "That's probably because I tackled your would-be robber," she said. He smiled, but then his expression shifted something softer, more serious. "No. It's more than that." She looked at him, her smile fading. "Don't fall for me just because I'm not impressed by your money." "I'm not," Elias said. "I'm falling for you because you make everything feel real." Her heart skipped. "You barely know me." "Then let me fix that," he said, stepping closer. "Let me know everything." She didn't answer, just leaned in and kissed him. It was soft at first, then deeper, and when they pulled apart, her fingers were still tangled in his coat. She whispered, "You really are Batman, aren't you?" Elias grinned. "Only for you." Neither of them knew it yet, but that was the moment everything changed. Erina's phone buzzed just as she was tying her apron at the diner. She glanced at the screen and paused. Elias. She hadn't expected to hear from him this early. He usually waited until after her shift, but today the message was simple. "I need you to trust me. Wear something warm." She raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. She had 5 hours of work ahead, and no time to decode cryptic messages from a man who, despite his charm and disarming attentiveness, still felt like a walking question mark. By the time her shift ended, she found a sleek sedan idling outside. The driver stepped out, holding the door open without a word. Inside was a heavy wool coat draped over the seat with a small envelope tucked into the collar. Her name was written in elegant handwriting. She opened it. "Come with me. I want to show you something that matters." No name. No instructions. Just that. She looked around, half expecting Elias to appear with a dramatic grin. But the street was quiet, and the driver simply said, "Miss Foster." She exhaled, grabbed the coat, and slid inside. They drove for nearly an hour, out of the city, past the glittering skyline, into a stretch of quiet roads flanked by bare trees and snow-dusted fields. The silence wasn't awkward, it was layered with anticipation she didn't want to admit she felt. When they finally stopped, she stepped out into a place that didn't look like it belonged anywhere near New York, a wide expanse of land with a single, long barn-style building that glowed with soft golden light. Inside, it was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet. There were rows of tables, long windows, and a few people bustling about with clipboards and bags of what looked like school supplies and winter coats. "What is this?" she asked. Elias walked out from behind a partition, wearing a gray sweater and jeans, his hair slightly tousled like he'd run his hands through it a dozen times. It was the first time she'd seen him dressed down. "It's a shelter," he said. "For families that fall through the cracks, moms with kids. People who don't qualify for certain programs but still need help." She blinked. "You run this." "I fund it," he said, "and I built it. After my mother passed, I started looking into places that helped people like she once was. But most of them were overcrowded, underfunded, or impossible to access, so I decided to create one." Erina stepped further in, taking it all in: the shelves of books in the corner, the play area, the kitchen where someone was stirring soup. It didn't feel sterile or cold. It felt lived in, safe. "I didn't expect this," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to think I only exist in penthouses and boardrooms," Elias said. "This is the side of me no one asks about." She turned to him. "Why show me?" "Because you're the first person I've met who might actually understand why it matters." She folded her arms, feeling suddenly seen in a way that made her uneasy. "You don't even know me well enough to say that. You grew up around people who had nothing," he said. "You work double shifts. You take care of everyone but yourself. You didn't look at me and see dollar signs. You saw someone who needed help. That's rare." She didn't answer. Her chest felt tight, like his words had brushed against something she hadn't realized was still raw. He walked over to a table, picked up a small coat, and held it out. "Help me sort these." For the next hour they worked side by side. She labeled bins, folded scarves, helped a volunteer organize a box of donated books. Elias didn't hover or micromanage. He worked like he'd done it 100 times before, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused. At one point, she caught him watching her out of the corner of his eye. "What?" she asked, lifting an eyebrow. "You fit here," he said simply. She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked away and kept folding. Later, as they stood outside sipping coffee from mismatched mugs, she finally asked, "Why did your mom need a place like this?" Elias stared ahead at the dark treetops. "She was a single parent. We bounced between rentals. Some months we were fine, others." He trailed off. "There were times we slept in her car, but she never let me feel it. She'd make it a game like we were camping. I didn't realize we were homeless until I was older." Erina looked over at him, her voice softer. "You don't have to tell me this." "I want to," he said. "You asked me once what I do. The truth is, I build things to protect people like her. I made my money fast tech startup, early buyout, the usual story, but none of it mattered until I had a reason." She didn't say anything for a long time. "Then you're not who I thought you were," he turned to her. "Who did you think I was?" "Some cocky rich guy playing games," she said, not unkindly. "But you're more complicated than that, and I'm still trying to decide if that's a good thing." He smiled faintly. "I'll take that as progress." As they drove back, she rested her head against the window, trying to process the shift in her chest. Elias Ferris was no longer just the man she'd saved. He was someone with shadows, with a past that echoed pieces of her own. But just as she started to relax, something on the news caught her attention. The driver had the radio on low, a report murmuring through the speakers. Ferris Holdings CEO under scrutiny as anonymous source leaks documents suggesting misuse of charity funds. She sat up straight. Did they just say Ferris Holdings? The driver's eyes met hers in the mirror but didn't speak. She turned to Elias. "That's you, isn't it?" He looked exhausted. "I didn't want you to find out like this." Her pulse quickened. "Are you being investigated?" "It's not what it sounds like," he said quickly. "Someone's trying to undermine what I built. The documents are fake, but the media doesn't care. They want a scandal." "Why would someone do that?" "Because power makes enemies. And I have more than my fair share." She stared at him. "You brought me to your shelter, introduced me to people who trust you, and the entire time you knew this was about to explode." "I didn't want to lie," he said, "but I didn't want to scare you away either." Her voice hardened. "So you thought showing me the good stuff would make me ignore the bad? I thought if you saw who I really am, you'd know I'm not the man the headlines make me out to be." She shook her head. "You should have told me. You should have trusted me." The car pulled up in front of her apartment. She grabbed the coat and got out without waiting for him to respond. He followed her to the curb. "Erina, please, I didn't plan this. I didn't plan you, but I'm not the villain in this story." She turned, eyes flashing. "Then stop acting like one." And with that, she walked inside, leaving him standing alone beneath the flickering street lamp, the coat she still wore the only thing tethering her to him. Elias didn't move for a long time. He just stared at the closed door, wondering if the one person who didn't care about his money now wouldn't care about him at all. Erina didn't sleep that night. Her body was exhausted, but her mind kept replaying everything: the ride out to the shelter, the softness in Elias's voice when he talked about his mother, the way his eyes shifted when the news report came on. He had looked cornered, not guilty. But what did that even mean? By morning, she was still in the coat he'd given her. She stared at it hanging over the back of her kitchen chair, wondering why she hadn't thrown it at him when she'd had the chance. It was warm, expensive, and smelled faintly like cedar and something clean. She hated that it comforted her. At the diner, her manager asked if she needed time off, which was just his passive-aggressive way of saying she looked like hell. She stayed anyway, keeping her head down, pouring coffee like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. Her phone buzzed once Elias's name, but she turned it face down and kept wiping counters. 2 days passed. On the third, a man in a navy suit stepped into the diner during the slow hour between breakfast and lunch. He looked out of place among the peeling linoleum and fogged windows. He scanned the room and walked directly to her. "Miss Foster?" he asked. "Depends who's asking." I'm Mr. Ferris's attorney, he said. He asked me to deliver something. She nearly rolled her eyes. He's sending lawyers now. He thought you wouldn't open your door if he came himself. She folded her arms. He's not wrong. The man handed her a folder, nodded once, and left. Inside were printed documents. Not legal ones, emails, screenshots, internal reports with timestamps and digital signatures. A handwritten note was clipped to the front. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just showing you the truth. Decide for yourself. She read it all 3 times. There were discrepancies in the leaked documents, fabricated entries, manipulated donation records, forged names. The originals, attached in the folder, told a different story. One where every dollar tracked cleanly, where the shelter's budget was transparent and accounted for. Names she didn't recognize were flagged in red, the same names mentioned in the news stories as anonymous sources. Someone inside his company was framing him. Erina set the folder down slowly. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't just walked away from a man in a scandal. She'd walked away from someone being hunted with precision. That night she didn't text, didn't call. She showed up. The doorman at Elias's building recognized her immediately and buzzed her up without asking. She stepped into the penthouse, unsure what she'd find. Elias was sitting in the dark, a single lamp on in the corner, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. He didn't look surprised to see her. Did you read it? She nodded. Why didn't you go public with this? Because the person behind it would have gone deeper underground. I needed them to stay close enough to catch. She crossed the room slowly. You're letting them destroy your name to set a trap. I've been called worse than a thief, Elias said, but I won't let them take what I built. You think it's someone on your executive team. I know it is. I just don't know which one yet. She sat across from him. That's why you brought me to the shelter. You were trying to anchor yourself. I was trying to breathe, he said, voice low, and you made it easier. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not asking for anything from you, Erina. I just didn't want the last thing between us to be a lie I never told. She reached for the glass he hadn't touched, took a sip, and handed it back. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you, she said. I'm here because I've been in your position. When everything you worked for is hanging by a thread and no one's listening, he looked at her. What happened? My mom got sick my senior year, she said. We were 2 months from eviction and I was trying to finish school and work nights. I asked for help. People said no, some were polite. Some weren't, but they all walked away. Elias didn't interrupt. I don't trust easy, she continued. So when I saw your name in that report, my first instinct was to run, but I should have given you a chance to explain. He stood slowly, walked to the window. You did. I just waited too long to take it, she followed him. So what now? I'm going to finish what I started, clear my name, take back what's mine. She studied his profile, the tight jaw, the tension in his shoulders. I want to help, he turned. No, she raised a brow. Excuse me. I don't want you anywhere near this, Elias said. It's ugly, dangerous, and it could cost you everything. I'm not fragile, she said, and you don't get to make that decision for me. He stepped closer. I'm asking you not to get involved, and I'm saying I already am. Their eyes locked, and the space between them shrank. Elias's voice dropped. You don't know what you're walking into. I know exactly what I'm walking into, Erina said. And I'm not leaving. He exhaled sharply, some of the tension bleeding from his expression. I can't protect you from this. She reached up, touched his jaw, then stopped trying to. He kissed her like he'd been holding back for days, no hesitation, no pretense. Just heat and urgency, and something that had been threatening to burn since the first night they met. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. Let's catch the bastard, she whispered. He smiled faintly. You really are something else. Over the next few days, Erina became his shadow. She attended board meetings under the guise of being his assistant. No one questioned her, not when Elias introduced her as part of his strategic advisory team. She took notes, watched body language, memorized who looked too nervous, who asked too few questions, who kept checking their phone. She met his CFO, his legal counsel, his investors. Most were polite, some were dismissive. One, a man named Spencer Hale, was too friendly, too eager to explain how the company was handling the fallout. Erina flagged him mentally. That night, she and Elias went over everything in his home office. "Spencer," she said, tapping her pen against the margin of her notes. "He keeps repeating the same talking points, like he's rehearsed." "He's always been careful," Elias said. "But lately, he's been pushing for me to make a public statement without clearing my name first. Because if you admit guilt in any form, the investigation becomes permanent." Elias looked at her. "You sure you never studied corporate sabotage? Just people," she said. "And he's hiding something." They kept digging. 2 nights later, Elias found it. A hidden subfolder in the company's internal server, encrypted but not well. Inside were drafts of the leaked documents, edited repeatedly by the same user ID, Spencer's. Elias didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just forwarded the files to his legal team with a single sentence: "Initiate proceedings." Then he turned to Erina. "You did this." "We did this," she corrected. He stepped forward, ran a hand through her hair. "I knew you were different the second you charged that guy at the ATM," he said. "But I had no idea you'd be the one to help me take back everything." She looked up at him. "You haven't even seen what I'm capable of yet." His eyes darkened, and he kissed her again, this time slow, deliberate, like he finally had permission to want her completely. As the city lights blinked below them, Elias Ferris knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just been saved that night, he'd been found. Snow had started to fall again, thick and quiet, blanketing the city in a kind of hush that made even Manhattan seem tender. Erina stood by the window of Elias's penthouse, watching the flakes swirl under the streetlights far below. Behind her, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting golden light across the room. She hadn't intended to stay the night, but neither of them had mentioned her leaving. It was as if they both understood that something had shifted permanently. Elias stepped behind her, not touching her yet, his voice low. "I've been summoned to the board." She turned to face him. He was already dressed, charcoal gray suit, no tie, his cufflinks gleamed like armor. "When?" "3 hours. Do they know?" "They will by the time I walk in." He didn't look nervous, but something about the way his jaw moved said he was restraining everything. Not fear, exactly, more like the weight of everything he was about to burn down. "What if they push back?" she asked. "They might, but I've got the original documents, the digital trail, and a full forensic audit on my side. And if that's not enough, I have something Spencer doesn't." She raised an eyebrow. "Me," she guessed. He shook his head. "The truth." He kissed the corner of her mouth, brief but grounding, then pulled away. "I want you there," he added, glancing at her reflection in the window. "Won't that raise eyebrows?" "Let them raise." 3 hours later, she walked beside him through the towering glass doors of Ferris Holdings headquarters. No one stopped them. No one even blinked. She wore a tailored black coat, borrowed from his closet, and her own boots, scuffed and real beneath polished marble floors. The contrast wasn't lost on her, and somehow it made her feel more grounded than she'd ever felt. The boardroom was filled with people in suits who had power stitched into their posture. Some stood as Elias entered. Others didn't. Spencer Hale sat at the far end, pale but composed, tapping a pen against his notepad like he wasn't seconds from being dismantled. Elias didn't introduce her. He simply took the head of the table and opened his laptop, projecting the files onto the screen behind him. "The documents leaked 2 weeks ago," he began, voice even, "suggested that our charity expenditures were fraudulent. They weren't. What you saw was a fabrication, one created by this man." He gestured to Spencer without looking at him, gasps. A few sharp exhales, but no one interrupted. "These are the original files," Elias continued, "unaltered, time-stamped, and verified by a third-party specialist. The alterations came from an internal IP address. I traced the edits. All of them point here." He tapped the keyboard again, and Spencer's user ID filled the screen. Spencer stood. "This is ridiculous. Anyone could have used my credentials." Elias didn't flinch. "That's why I had the server logs pulled. The edits were made from your office computer. During hours, you were the only one inside." Silence stretched like a wire. "I can explain," Spencer started. "You had every chance to," Elias said. "Instead, you set fire to everything this company built." One of the board members, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes to match, leaned forward. You intend to press charges? Elias didn't hesitate. Absolutely. 2 security officers entered without being called. Spencer tried to speak again, but no one was listening anymore. The board turned their eyes away as he was escorted out. Elias closed the laptop. His voice was quieter now. I started this company with the intention of building something that would last, something honest. And I let someone inside who didn't share that vision. That's on me, but I'm done letting it slide. He met each gaze around the table. We rebuild from the ground up. No one objected. When the meeting dissolved, Erina waited outside the glass doors, arms folded, heart thudding. He stepped out and leaned against the wall beside her. Well, he said, exhaling, that happened. What now? We restructure, he said, and I take a break. She tilted her head. You, a break? He looked at her, and for once there was no guardedness in his expression. I want to take you somewhere. Where? Somewhere I haven't taken anyone in years. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. The next morning, a jet waited for them at a private airfield. She didn't ask how far or how long. She just stepped aboard and watched the ground fall away beneath them. The flight was quiet, comfortable. Elias leaned back in his seat, arm draped behind her, fingers brushing her shoulder lightly. He hadn't explained, but the look in his eyes was different now, not urgent, but steady. Like whatever storm he'd been fighting had finally passed. When they landed, the sun was just rising, casting a pale blush across the snow-capped hills. A car waited for them, and an hour later they pulled up in front of a modest cabin nestled near a frozen lake. Smoke curled from the chimney. Icicles glittered from the eaves. He looked over at her, suddenly unsure. My mother used to bring me here, he said. After she died, I stopped coming, but I always meant to. Erina stepped out of the car first. The cold hit her lungs like glass, but it was clean, sharp, pure. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and old memories. A few photographs lined the walls, one of a young boy with wild hair and a woman with tired eyes but a radiant smile. Erina paused in front of it. She had your mouth, she said softly. She had everything, Elias replied. She was the reason I kept going. They spent the day chopping wood, cooking whatever was in the pantry and walking across the frozen lake, their breath fogging in the air as they talked, not about the company or the sabotage or the future, just about things they hadn't had time to say. That night, wrapped in a blanket beside the fireplace, Elias took her hand. I almost didn't stop at that ATM, he said. I was going to head home. I was tired, angry, but I did, and you charged a would-be mugger with a handbag, she finished. He smiled. And changed everything. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know who I was, he said, until you reminded me. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath. You're not afraid anymore, she said. I was never afraid of the truth, he replied. Just what it might cost me. She tilted her head up. And what did it cost? He kissed her forehead. Only the things I didn't need anymore. The next morning, he stood at the edge of the lake with a phone in one hand and a small velvet box in the other. She stayed inside, watching, sensing something shift again. When he came back in, his eyes were bright with something unspoken. I made a call, he said. To who? My board, my lawyer, the press. She raised a brow. You just cleared your name publicly, didn't you? He nodded. But that's not what matters. He stepped closer, opened the box, and held it out. Inside was a ring, simple, breathtaking, a single diamond set in a band of platinum that shimmered like starlight. I don't want a ceremony, he said. Not until you're ready. I don't care about the date or the guest list. I just want to know you're mine and I'm yours. She blinked, stunned. Are you proposing? I'm asking you to stop being the woman who runs when she's scared, he said, and start being the woman who stays when it matters. She didn't hesitate. She took the ring, slid it on, and then laughed through the tears that came anyway. Fine, she said, but only if I get to pick the cake. He pulled her close, kissed her until the fire behind them dimmed and the world outside disappeared. Months later, a new shelter opened in Brooklyn under her name. She ran it herself. He built the infrastructure behind it, but the heart of it was hers. They worked side by side, different worlds colliding in perfect rhythm. And every time someone asked how they met, Elias would only say, "She saved me." Because she had, not just from the man at the ATM, but from himself. The scent of orange blossoms clung to the air as Erina stepped barefoot across the cool marble tiles of the Tuscany estate's courtyard. Morning sun streamed through the olive trees, casting dappled shadows across the terracotta walls. She wore a loose shirt of Elias's, the sleeves rolled up, her curls twisted into a lazy knot at the top of her head. The courtyard was quiet except for the occasional trill of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the vines. Elias had disappeared before dawn. She'd woken to a note written in his familiar block lettering, the ink slightly smudged like he'd hesitated before sliding it under her palm. Walk to the garden. Don't rush. She'd never been one to obey cryptic instructions, but this time her pulse buzzed with curiosity instead of irritation. The months since the boardroom showdown had been a blur of rebuilding, expansion, and travel. But this trip was the first time they'd stopped. No meetings. No press. No deadlines. Just the two of them and a sun-drenched villa he'd apparently bought years ago and never once visited. She passed under an archway wrapped in jasmine, the scent thick and sweet, and entered the garden. It was quiet, private, encircled by tall cypress trees and awash in sunlight. In the center stood Elias, wearing a buttoned white shirt and linen pants, barefoot on the grass, her breath caught not because of the way he looked, though that never failed, but because of what stood behind him. A long table stretched across the garden, set for two, draped in ivory silk and scattered with white gardenias. Beyond it, a low trellis covered in climbing roses framed a view of the distant hills. Floating candles bobbed in a nearby fountain. "You did all this?" Her voice was part incredulous, part awed. He turned, the corner of his mouth lifting. "I had help, but yes." She walked toward him, gaze sweeping the scene. "Are you trying to bribe me with flowers and candlelight?" "No," he said. "I'm trying to give us a moment that doesn't belong to anyone else." She stopped in front of him, hands slipping into his. "You already have me." "I know," he said softly, "but I want to ask you anyway." He reached into his pocket and dropped to one knee. The moment slowed, the breeze stilled. The world narrowed to his face, his voice, and the way his hands didn't tremble even slightly as he held out a ring so intricately designed, it looked like it was made for her and her alone. "I don't want to be the man who waits for the right time. I want to be the man who makes time right. You walked into my life like a storm and gave me calm. You challenged every part of me and made me better without ever asking for anything in return. So I'm asking now, marry me. Not for the press, not for the future we're building, but because I can't imagine any version of my life that doesn't include you in it." Erina didn't answer immediately. Her throat tightened, and her eyes burned with the kind of tears she only allowed in private. She dropped to her knees in front of him, cupped his face, and kissed him. When she pulled back, her voice was barely a whisper. "I've never had a home before you. Yes, of course, yes." They never made it to the table. The garden faded behind them as they stumbled into the villa, hands tangled, laughter breathless, the sunlight chasing them through the open doors. They made love with the windows open, the hills of Tuscany watching, the world far, far behind them. They were married 3 weeks later. Not in a cathedral, not on a yacht, but under a canopy of lights in the same garden, surrounded by only those who mattered. A local officiant led the ceremony in Italian and English. There was no aisle, no fanfare, just Erina in a silk dress she'd chosen that morning and Elias in a white shirt she'd insisted he not button all the way. She wore her curls loose, wild, untamed, exactly as he loved them. During the vows, she looked up at him, her voice steady. "You never tried to fix me. You saw what was cracked and chose to love it anyway. I've spent most of my life surviving. You're the first thing I've ever wanted to live for." He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low, reverent. "I spent years building things that didn't last. You're the only thing I've ever built with my heart, and I will spend the rest of my life protecting that." They didn't kiss at the end of the ceremony. They clung. The kind of kiss that didn't end so much as melt into the next moment, like the start of something infinite. Later that night, they stole away from the guests and returned to the courtyard, barefoot and wine-drunk. The candles had burned low, and the stars had taken their place. "I never asked you," she said, tracing the edge of his collarbone, "where you learned to love like this." He took her hand, kissed each fingertip. I watched someone love without ever being loved back. I decided I'd never do anything halfway. She leaned into him. We're not halfway anything, are we? He pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her. We're everything. In the following months, they didn't retreat from life, they expanded into it. Elias stepped down from day-to-day operations and moved into a role that allowed him freedom to travel, create, and invest in causes he believed in. Erina took the lead on a national network of shelters, this time backed by a foundation they co-founded together. She refused to let it become another polished charity with no soul. Every program was built around real people, real needs, real change. They lived between New York and Tuscany, but home became wherever the other was. On a rainy day in spring, Erina stood outside a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the largest women and children transitional complex in the Northeast. A local reporter asked her what motivated her to dedicate her life to this. She looked over her shoulder at Elias, who was crouched beside a little girl showing him her drawing of a house with a red roof. She turned back to the reporter and said, "I was once the girl on the other side of the door. Now I want to be the one holding it open." That night, Elias carried her into their room, still damp from the rain, her laughter echoing off the walls. "What?" he asked, setting her down gently. "You," she said, brushing a raindrop from his cheek. "You make the world feel like something I can trust." He kissed her slowly, deeply, with the kind of certainty that only grows stronger with time. They never stopped being a storm, but they were a storm that built, not destroyed, a force that carved out space for others. And when they danced in their kitchen at midnight, barefoot, tangled in each other, with the music low and the lights off, they knew something neither of them had ever believed in before. Forever wasn't a fairy tale, it was a choice, and they chose each other every single day.